Hello, my name is Nate McDowell, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us to discuss the impacts of rising CO2 and rising VPD on plant physiology, hydrology, and climate. Now, CO2 and VPD are rising and are expected to continue rising in the future. Here you can see CMIP5 Ensemble Global Land Surface Predictions of rising CO2, the blue line, rising temperature, which is obviously dependent on that rising CO2, the green line, and the subsequent rise in vapor pressure deficit that is in lockstep with the rising temperature and CO2. Notably, VPD is dependent on both temperature and humidity, and therefore the relatively non-trend in humidity shown here has very minimal effect. Therefore, the rise in VPD is almost exclusively due to rising temperature. I would note that observations support these model predictions. For the last 50 years or so, we see a global VPD rise when we examine it through observations at a regional scale across the globe. Now, this rise in CO2 and rise in VPD creates a physiological conflict. The figure on the left shows the typical response of photosynthesis to rising CO2, which is a large increase as CO2 increases. The figure on the right shows that carbon uptake declines dramatically with rising VPD. This is because as VPD increases, stomatal conductance generally declines to minimize transpiration losses, but this stomatal closure results in a decline in photosynthesis. Now, vapor pressure deficit, let's remind ourselves, is the evaporative demand for water, and as shown in the left-hand figure, it is an exponential function of temperature. As temperature rises, the vapor pressure inside the leaf, denoted as EI, and the vapor pressure outside the leaf, denoted as EA, both rise. However, it rises much more dramatically inside the leaf. This results in an increase in VPD, the difference in water vapor pressure between the inside and the outside of the leaf, which causes an increase in transpiration according to Fick's law, unless, as I mentioned before, stomata close, in which case transpiration can be minimized. However, CO2 uptake is also minimized. I'd like to focus in particular on transpiration as we go forward here, because transpiration is this key sensitive flux to VPD and to CO2, because transpiration has a large effect on the biology of plants and on the hydrology of the subsurface and ultimately on climate. Rising VPD reduces stomatal conductance, as I mentioned earlier. You can see this in the upper right-hand figure, using multiple models that were validated by data. And this is a very typical response seen throughout the literature. The lower right-hand figure shows that rising VPD increases transpiration until severe stomatal closure, at least in some models. And in some models, the transpiration rates stay at elevated values despite the severe stomatal closure. This is because VPD has a very dominating effect on the flux of water from the inside to the outside of a leaf. At the leaf level, transpiration goes up significantly with temperature, which we can see by comparing the green, the blue, and the red lines. Given that temperature is strongly related to VPD, this is functionally a VPD response curve. However, as CO2 goes up from the left to the right-hand side of the figure, we see a decline in transpiration. So again, this brings up the emergent question: what is the net effect, and what will be the net effect, of rising CO2 and rising VPD? Let's note that stomatal conductance does go down, at least in some plant functional types, with increasing CO2. But at the same time, there's a counteracting force on transpiration, which is that leaf area index, or LAI, in the right-hand figure, also goes up significantly with CO2. So you have counteracting factors if stomatal conductance does decline with elevated CO2. But if leaf area increases with elevated CO2, the net impact on transpiration could be nil. And in fact, in greenhouse studies with potted plants, we see that elevated CO2 has no impact on transpiration. But this is due to a balance of reduced tomatal conductance with increased leaf area under conditions of higher CO2. But notably, temperature treatments, which in this case were again strong VPD treatments, overwhelmed CO2 in driving transpiration, which we can see by comparing the red to the blue lines. Now, global evapotranspiration seems to increase with leaf area as well. This suggests that the processes we see at the leaf scale and at the whole plant scale do go up to the level of the global terrestrial biosphere. Multiple papers have come out since Zhang et al. 2018 supporting this result. Now, does VPD and leaf area overwhelm CO2 water savings? Well, water savings should result in an increase in soil moisture. However, CMIP5 models suggest that by 2100 we will have significant decreases in soil moisture or soil drought. This can be seen by the higher abundance of red colors throughout the figures. I would note that this raises the question of droughts being considered press versus pulse disturbances. We typically think of them as pulse disturbances. They don't happen every year. They're infrequent, but when they happen, they're significant. However, the increasing frequency and intensity that is chronically rising and expected to continue rising of soil moisture drought brings up the questions about acclimation over time, about legacy impacts, other effects at the ecological and physiological scales, and hydrologic and climatic scales that may be accumulating through the increasing frequency of these disturbances. In other words, it's an interesting question about how we considered droughts. Rising VPD underlies predictions of increasing tree mortality. The figure on the left was from a paper that really made me understand the importance of vapor pressure deficit. In this study, led by Park Williams, a postdoc of mine at the time, we compared tree ring estimates and mortality estimates to climate variables, and then used those climate variables to forecast mortality into the future for the southwestern USA for 3 dominant conifers. And what we found was that as time progressed, mortality is predicted to strongly increase. This result was dominated by the VPD increase over time and the tight correlation between mortality and VPD in the past. The figures on the right are 4 Earth system model simulations of conifer mortality likelihood by 2100. Red areas indicate declines in conifer abundance due to mortality, and blue areas indicate increases in conifer survival. You can see that the temperate zone is in particular threatened by a loss of conifers in the future. Again, this result is strongly dependent on vapor pressure deficit rise. I would note that the boreal forest predictions of decreased mortality, the blue areas, are a bit at odds with empirical observations of increasing water stress and decreasing carbon storage in the boreal zone. That highlights that potentially the boreal zone is important to study to better understand what the balance of CO2 rises, temperature rises, and VPD rises will be. But likewise, the temperate zone is clearly an important zone to study because of its potential vulnerability. So the ultimate question people have been asking is, are we shifting from a CO2 to a VPD-dominated world? A number of papers have come out suggesting that we are, due to increasing VPD impacts on growth and on photosynthesis. At a minimum, this is a very valuable, intriguing, and important hypothesis. And it's supported by multiple levels of data from leaf to global scales. However, it's a major question if we can model this and what the major impacts, the net impacts will be. I want to scale this to the impacts of changing CO2 and VPD on hydrology and climate. Transpiration consumes approximately 70% of precipitation. So small changes in transpiration actually have large potential impacts on the energy balance of ecosystems, on hydrology such as groundwater recharge and stream flow, and on the carbon cycle through the linkages between transpiration, stomatal conductance, and photosynthesis. Therefore, transpiration and its dependence on CO2 and VPD is a very large lever on multiple Earth system processes that we care about. A hydrologic example comes from predictions from the CMIP models of reduced runoff despite increased canopy resistance to transpiration, in which canopy resistance is the inverse of stomatal conductance. You can see the decline in stomatal conductance or increase in canopy resistance in the left-hand figure, where brown areas had a decline in stomatal conductance over time. However, in conjunction, as we look at the figure on the right, we find that the transpiration to runoff ratio is very regionally variable in the future. However, it does suggest that in some areas there could be a significant loss of water from the canopy, these are the brown areas, relative to runoff, meaning that either transpiration increased a lot and runoff didn't change, or transpiration increased very minimally, but runoff declined significantly, or some balance of the both. Notably, in a lot of the tropics, but not all of the Amazon, we see the opposite, where transpiration may have held steady or even declined as runoff may have increased. There's big questions about the regional accuracy, but the trends are exciting and interesting and concerning in terms of how this may impact subsurface hydrology. The climate example comes from this slide where the models have predicted significant impacts, for example, of transpiration dominating rainfall changes in the tropics under elevated CO2, as shown in the figure on the left. And equally, transpiration was the dominant driver of 100-year floods in the tropics under elevated CO2, shown in the figure in the right. This highlights that the shifts in transpiration due to CO2 and/or VPD may have large impacts on climate. I note that these studies shown here were focused on CO2. So the question remains, how would the interaction of VPD and CO2 occur? So how do we reconcile the different hypotheses? One hypothesis being that water savings will occur via rising CO2. Another being that water savings will not occur, and in fact water loss will increase due to increase in leaf area and VPD. The figure on the left compares observations of transpiration between elevated CO2 and control plots at the Duke and Oak Ridge National Lab face sites, where you can see from the gray bar at the top that there was no significant impact of, or at least a very small impact of elevated CO2 on transpiration in those two studies. The models that were compared to the observations tended to underestimate the transpiration in the control plots, in the CO2 enriched plots relative to the control plots. In other words, they did suggest declines in transpiration as an effect of elevated CO2. This similar result can be seen in the middle panels, in which Earth system models do suggest significant water savings because of relatively flat transpiration results as CO2 increase, as shown by the blue lines in the upper panel, despite the increase in potential evapotranspiration, the red lines. Note that potential evapotranspiration is, to some degree, in equivalence with VPD. This increasing potential evapotranspiration relative to transpiration resulted in water savings, as shown in the bottom figure, where transpiration relative to potential evapotranspiration declined. So the figure on the left suggests that water savings may be insignificant, The figure in the middle suggests that water savings may be significant. The figure on the right suggests that it may be that elevated CO2 and elevated BPD may actually balance each other. You see here hydraulic failure, which is dehydration that results in mortality, increases with drought. This is a series of simulations with 5 ecosystem models in which comparing results to observations of death and hydraulic failure in a spruce forest that died of drought in 2018. You can see that elevated CO2, in other words, running the model for the same sites, for the same trees, but under forecasted CO2 concentrations of 2100, the green line, results in a decline in the likelihood of hydraulic failure. And this is because of both water savings below ground, an increase in soil moisture, as well as driven by the decrease in transpiration, which equally affects hydraulic failure. Higher transpiration rates result in higher likelihood of hydraulic failure. So the reduction in transpiration both gave the plants more water and reduced risk simultaneously. The ambient treatment is shown as the dark brown line in the middle. That was a comparison of the models to the 2018 drought event. The elevated VPD treatment is the yellow line, and of course, as expected, rising VPD caused an increasing likelihood of hydraulic failure. But notably, when you compare the elevated CO2 and elevated VPD scenario simulations to the ambient, those are the two middle lines, the differences are insignificant. This suggests that rising CO2 and rising VPD may balance each other in terms of their impacts on the likelihood of, in this case, mortality. So how do we move forward with manipulative experiments to understand and test our hypotheses regarding the net impacts of rising CO2 and VPD? Well, I believe the spruce experiment is actually ideal for this. And the reason why is because of the manipulated CO2 concentrations with and without elevated VPD impacts. The figure on the lower left shows that as temperature treatments rise, so does VPD. Manipulating VPD via a change in temperature is actually very realistic because this is what's occurring in nature. So I feel like both in terms of the rigor in the design and the treatments, the spruce study is excellent and highlight that there are impacts, such as shown in the picture in the top middle, where dying trees have been observed in the elevated temperature or VPD chambers. Now, we might want to consider in addition drought, because as we discussed earlier, drought increases are a result of rising VPD in terms of soil drought. And it could be additionally impacting precipitation. Therefore, the combination of drought studies, such as shown in the lower right, with CO2 and VPD treatments could be very wise to enable us to predict the consequences of these changes in the future. Now, doing a drought study in a bog may not be the most logical place, like at spruce. However, replicating the spruce design with and without drought treatments in other ecosystems in both the temperate and the boreal and the tropical zone could be very wise because we know that droughts will occur in most of these systems at some time in the future as CO2 and VPD are rising. And to that point, thinking about the key ecosystems to study, I would argue at this point, as a first cut, I think we need to study them all in tropical, temperate, and boreal zones. This is because CO2 and VPD are going up everywhere. It's not isolated to certain regions or certain biomes or certain ecosystem types. And likewise, we know that droughts happen everywhere. Not every year, not necessarily every decade, but they do occur everywhere at some point, and now they are occurring when they do under elevated conditions of CO2 and VPD. I'd like to conclude with highlighting some of the key tests that we need to pursue via both measurements and models as we move forward. First of all, understanding the net impact of CO2 versus VPD on whole plants to model conductance photosynthesis, leaf area, and transpiration is needed to better understand the impacts on land surface physiology, on the carbon cycle, and in the water cycle. And in that vein, we should be understanding and studying how shifts in transpiration, if indeed they occur, alter the subsurface water fluxes and stores, such as groundwater recharge, surface runoff, or stream flow, because any shifts in transpiration could have large impacts on these subsequent fluxes and stores. And lastly, we should be tracing if and how shifts in the energy balance associated with rising CO2 and VPD could occur because of their subsequent influences on climate. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I will enjoy discussion later in this session. Bye.